science was way up north in the Bronx, and Brooklyn Tech was closer, but still far enough to take a subway so I could get away from my family. It was the first choice I made to alienate myself from parts of my family and become living in the free world. For me, the free world was living away from home. Brooklyn Tech was, I loved the machine shops. And I used to pride myself on how brilliantly I could make grind tool bits, which was an achievement. And I loved working on an engine, not on the engine lathe, which was impersonal, but on little bench lathes where you turn the thing by hand, you adjust it by hand, and I loved the feel of the bench lathe. And I loved making things for casting, and we had courses in casting and courses in machining stuff. And it was one of the great pleasures. I still to this day could probably make a diagram of a Bessemer converter or an open hearth furnace, which I had drawn very lovingly in a notebook that my mother, in a fit of rage against my alienated character, destroyed it 2 nights before it was graded. And somehow or other I didn't murder her, which I regard as an example of total triumph of virtue. So yeah, I had many jobs that depended. Most kids got summer jobs that were less well paying because I was a reasonably accomplished machinist. So I could get jobs that depended upon my skill or my ability to sell myself as skillful, and then I'd be able to do what they needed to be done. But it turned out that the kind of inventor I wanted to be was not an engineer, but a writer. I discovered this while I was in college. And although I had, you know, like a friend of mine, Wilson, his name was Wilson, he was a novelist also, was an old friend of mine. We used to hang out together in Brooklyn bars on the other day and plan to do a great movie of Finnegan's Wake. Gertrude Stein was my other entry into modern experimental poetry. I discovered 3 lives in the school library. God knows how come they did it, but Tech was a very good school, so it must have been somebody in the English department who said, get Gertrude Stein, although I couldn't find any of her other books there. But if you discover Gertrude Stein at 16, the world looks much more open than if you discover Philip Larkin.
It comes again.
Well, I use him as an example because he's not the worst. Well, I mean, they would say he's among the better poets, and if they use that as an example, I would say that he has the same problems that Robert Frost has, a decayed rhetoric. Like I have in this book a severe attack upon Frost as suffering from an insufficiency of gracefulness, and the language is wooden. And the trouble is with its woodenness is not an individual defect. It was a cultural defect at the time he was writing. That the gentility of the notion of what constituted literature, there was a notion of gentility and a refinement attached to it that wouldn't let him use the natural flow of the language. And his metric often kills his line, because he says things like, something there is that does not love offense. You mean there's something that doesn't love offense? No, he means something there is that does not love offense. Why does it require that absurdity? I could say elves to him. Like hell you could. The adjacent farm, they're talking about the value of repairing the fence between them to keep them separated. And I say, there's something there is that does not love offense. But he would want to know what it is. I could say elves to him, and you know, nowhere in his lifetime could he have said to his next door neighbor, elves are the cause of the problem. Yeah, elves. Elves? Yeah, elves. Yeah, they would kind of come around all the time around Christmas. Little elves with stocking caps. That's an absurdity. On the other hand, he's a poet of images that are strong, and And so you have images that are strong in language that's very pathetic. He lived at the wrong time. 40 years later, I guess it might have been possible for him to break free because the genteel tradition was breaking up. The poem was probably written around 1906 or something like that. And by the end of the Second World War, the colloquial was beginning to make its appearance in literary works. And certainly by the time of the 50s, you had the great Renaissance led by Black Mountain and the Beats, and a whole bunch of poets that really made it open up, forced it open. People like Olson, and Duncan, and Creeley. Creeley was a superb opener of the field as well. And Duncan is, of course, the question is, how can you like Duncan? What I like about Duncan is he's absurd. His absurdity is what I love.
He liked elves, though, too.
What?
He liked elves also.
Yeah, but he treats himself to the full range of absurdity. I mean, he dances the absurdity out, and the language is hilarious.
Right. And it's looser, too,
Yeah.
in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the trouble with Sir Frost is he's always restraining himself, trying to remain decorous, and there's no point to it. Anyway.
I'm just interested in this idea that Frost is bad because he's not sensible in a sense, and just trying to reconcile that with your love of Stein, which I share. But I'm thinking of Stein saying something like, "A little monkey goes like a donkey," you know.
Yeah, but that's manifestly absurd in a playful way, as Duncan is also. You can never take anything Duncan says as being a truthful statement.
And also Duncan has a little touch of humor there, too.
Always.
Yeah, which Frost lacks.
Well, Frost really does lack it. I mean, he took himself very seriously, and he took his mythology very seriously. And it's a bad weakness. I'm not looking for poets to be sensible. I'm looking for them, as it were, to be comfortable in the public, in a common space shared by all of us. And they can have private spaces that are specialized for reasons that they need to, but that's not the same thing as glorifying those spaces. I mean, if Hopkins' fiery rhetoric would work for him to a degree, it's like he called up the fire and then put it out before it dealt with it. He could do anything. He didn't have the sense of the adequate. He didn't have an adequate arsonist sensibility.
This common space shared by all of us, what you just said, and the fact that you said earlier on, I don't expect people to listen to me and agree with me, and so makes me think of what you say in Fine Furs about your Sky poems, where you say they were first perhaps more democratic than any other kind of poetry, and then you add, well, perhaps they're actually more aristocratic than anything else, because I'm not thinking of the people there. They just exist, and people have to deal with them the way they can. Which led me into thinking about your talk pieces. How do they sit regarding this notion of democracy, and how do you regard your audience? Because this was one of the questions that emerged this morning, the question of your audience and your relation to your audience, whom you address sometimes directly.
Well, actually, when I was thinking of a kind of democratic aristocracy, in which anybody who wanted to could enter that democracy, if they wanted it enough. All they had to do was learn how to do it. You might have to learn how to read Mallarmé, or you might have to learn to do other things like learn enough for Bion's Argot, or it depends what you have to do. I assume my audience is not specialized generally, not in all the things that interest me. and I'm not either. So I'm talking in what I regard as essentially a common linguistic space. And I assume that the audience will be interested in it because, like, I'm basically a human being and they're human beings, and we live in the same culture, more or less. And I assume that they'll be as interested as reasonable. And if it's a subject that doesn't get to them, like the machine issue, if they're not interested at all in machines, they may find some of the things I do. For example, I have a talk piece, the beginning of which consists of an enormously long account of how a mousetrap is constructed. And it amuses me that this technical device of such great elegance is devoted essentially to killing mice. And I think in a way, people are really surprised when they think about the concentrated intelligence with which the trap is constructed. There's a certain elegance to it, that, like a set of logical propositions. If this happens, this happens. If this happens, this will happen. If this happens, this will happen. Bang. You know, it's a chain of implications. So my relationship to machines is like my relationship to certain kinds of chains of ideas.
But also, since you're mentioning that, the trap thing, in that same, when you mention the machine, you end up, if I remember correctly, on the fact that you actually are on what do you call it, a geological fault, and so that this machine can work well, but in the end there might be a slight problem with it, which is which doesn't depend on the machine, but on the conditions of the machine, and so therefore, I think you're saying in the talk that the metaphor or the comparison actually doesn't work properly because there's this fault there lying there.
Ready to cause it. Yeah, well, no, I'm saying the contingent, like the earth tremor that will, spring the trap of the thing is a little different from Hopkins' Ricker de Deutschland or from Mallarmé, but ultimately it's the same notion of the contingent interruption of your intentionality. Your ability to deal with the contingent is really the important thing as I'm concerned. And we all deal with it as well as we can, but the contingent is never easily absorbed, except by systems that tend to break down. So, I mean, living on a fault, which we do, and all of California lives on faults, some bigger, some, and you don't know what they're going to do, and if they do it, you have to deal with it with them. There's not much you can do otherwise. Yeah.
About